Welcome. I'm delighted to see you. My name is Russ Ganem, and I am Associate Provost and Dean of International Programs here at the University of Iowa. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our annual Commitment to Internationalization lecture, delivered by our distinguished guest, Deborah Kagan. Before introducing Deborah, I'd like to give you some background on the Commitment to Internationalization lecture series. Established in 2016, this series features experts in the field of international education and world events. These experts help to foster ongoing campus-wide conversations about the UI's vision and strategic themes for campus internationalization. Topics are intended to have broad interest among faculty, administrators, and students. We begin this series and chose today's speaker, especially with our students in mind. To be effective citizens and to excel in their chosen careers, Iowa students must develop cross-cultural competencies, and we must provide them opportunities to learn and to function successfully within global environments. The learning and discovery guided by the faculty at the University of Iowa reshape our understanding of the world, improve quality of life for many, and create economic benefits in the state of Iowa and around the globe. International relationships and partnerships add value to and expand the reach of our curricula, research, outreach, and economic development activities. Our goal is to leverage these partnerships and act as a global institution so that we may position ourselves to excel in the coming decades. All of which brings us to Deborah Kagan, Senior Advisor at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and Distinguished Fellow at the Transatlantic Leadership Network. Deborah lends expertise in the fields of security and energy policy. She is a retired, although we use that term quite loosely, policy advisor and senior official to the U.S. Departments of State and Defense. She has decades of experience in the realm of international security, including zones of conflict. Today's talk will explore the intricate dynamics shaping America's role on the global stage. This event presents a unique opportunity for students, faculty, and community members to engage with evolving issues in international relations, from shifting alliances to emerging security challenges. Deborah Kagan is also a senior advisory board member for Strategist, a nonprofit dedicated to developing high-tech education, training, and jobs in Eurasia and the Caucasus. She is a regular opinion contributor on multiple publications and to television and radio media around national security issues. A former senior career U.S. State and Department of Defense official working from the Reagan to Trump administrations, Deborah Kagan served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for Coalition, Peacekeeping, Humanitarian, and Disaster Relief, Senior Director for European, Russian, and European Security Issues, Special Advisor for Strategic and Nuclear Policy, Political and Diplomatic Advisor to senior U.S. and NATO military officials, including the Chairman and Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, several commanders, and U.S. and allied commanders deployed in operations. While completing postgraduate work at the University of Chicago towards her doctorate, Deborah Kagan was named the first woman fellow at the prestigious Armed Forces and Society Consortium. She holds bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Iowa in political science and journalism. And it is our privilege to welcome her today. So before we begin, please let me thank our staff, especially Daniel Vorwerk and Amy Green, for putting together today's program. Let's give them a round of applause. And I also wanted to explain our format. So it's kind of like a fireside chat. Deborah will deliver a few remarks at the beginning. Afterwards, Brian Lai, who is the chair of the Political Science Department, and I will ask her a series of questions based on her remarks, and then we'll open up the questioning to you. You have a pen and 3x5 cards in front of you. We think it's a little bit more efficient for you to write out your questions Daniel will come and pick them up, and then we will deliver them to Deborah, and she will answer. So without further delay, please give Deborah a warm welcome, and we look forward to her introductory remarks.
Thank you. Because the room is so small too, I'd really like to know who's asking me those questions. So
sure. So please introduce yourselves. Yes.
When you do that, and because it's a small crowd, I think this really lends itself to something more conversational. And I think for the students here, you get lectured all the time, and you certainly don't need that from me. So because it's probably no longer a hobby for you. So I'm just going to open it up by saying a few words here on a couple of things. One is thank you for having me here. It's a great honor to talk to you. But even more importantly for me is I want to hear from you, your thoughts, because you're the next generation of leaders. I'm on my way out, and I really want to make sure that get the knowledge and understanding of each other, of what you're thinking, what's important to you, why is it important to you, and how you feel about things. Because I think there's too many people in my age group who are convinced they have all the answers and they don't want to hear from everyone else. I'm not that person. I might disagree with you, but I do want to hear from you. A couple of just points here. U.S. national security has always depended on more than just the physical security of American territory. And history is replete with strategic miscalculations because Americans failed to understand that even if they did not consider certain countries as their enemies, those saw America as such. So your enemy gets a vote. And while successive U.S. administrations and our allies and friends often call them our strategic competitors, the truth is our adversaries call us and the liberal world order the enemy. And I think it's useful to take them at their word on these sorts of things. Historically, we took far too long to understand the axis developing in the 30s would bring us into a war we foolishly thought would never include us. We were guided by isolationists, and some of whom I might add, and I'm going to go off my script here, we're now seeing today on the left and on the right in this country and elsewhere, who believe that because you're surrounded by two oceans, you don't have to be involved, and you can just sort of look internally instead of externally. And but today, despite the lessons of Hitler marching unchecked through Europe with stunning acquiescence and naivete, of the Great Britain, France, and a wink and a nod from Stalin, an agreement shattered in less than 6 months, there are still those in the West who believe that Ukraine ceding a huge slice of its sovereign territory to Russia will appease the invader. This is the same foolish and dangerous logic which American isolationists voiced after France fell to the Nazis in 1940. Germany's material and manpower advantage meant Great Britain was doomed, and the U.S. should not have passed Lend-Lease. And Israel was doomed in 48, 56, 67, and 73. And George Washington, by the way, and the Continental Army apparently were doomed in 1775, never mind the War of 1812. But it's the same sort of logic. It's a path of defeatism guaranteed to give aid and comfort to every tyrant on this planet who believes that superior numbers in personnel and weapons are reason enough to crush any sovereign nation which chooses a destiny different from that of its regional bully. They still cling to this hope when Russia occupies Transnistria, since mere weeks after Moldova's independence in 1991. Parts of Georgia since 2008, I believe it's 20% of Georgia's geography, and Ukraine since 2014. And in the Indo-Pacific, some here and in other countries want to placate China by throwing Taiwan under the proverbial bus. There are those convinced that some contortionist-like architecture of a ceasefire that essentially rewards Putin with 20% of Ukraine will somehow make the threat magically disappear. Assuming we seek success more than just a fleeting halt to fighting, peace initiative tinkering will not help further this cause. Excuse me, I'm not smart enough to know this by heart. And so such an incredibly ill thought out narrative is a gift to Putin, who is watching for what he confidently hopes will be America blinking first. But those who live in the neighborhoods where these vanguards of the self-proclaimed New World Order threaten them daily know better. After years of indecision, Finland and Sweden completely abandoned what had increasingly become a fig leaf of non-alignment to join NATO. South Korea has ramped up its military readiness and military industry to historic levels. Japan, even with the new government, is taking actions that would have been impossible constitutionally a few years ago. And the Philippines, so proud of kicking the US out, now they're almost daily victims of Chinese interference and attacks against their fishing industry. I've lost count of how many Philippine ships the Chinese have sunk recently. I don't know if you know that one, Brian, but it's quite a number. Are welcoming back a very strong US presence. Australia and New Zealand are embarking on a vigorous path to ensure defense of their homelands. Perhaps what is most compelling is that our Indo-Pacific allies are increasingly tied to the democracies in Europe because they understand there is no daylight at all between Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. Earlier this week, South Korea briefed the North Atlantic Council, which is NATO's main council, at NATO headquarters in Brussels. This is a first on North Korea. South Korea went there. Every Pacific partner to NATO showed up at that meeting. That's not happened. They come to the general meetings, but it's never happened that they were the main briefer on that meeting. We're in the midst of a very volatile and dangerous time. The supposed comfort of not having to worry about great power competition while fighting successive wars against terrorism and endless counterinsurgencies is gone. The post-Cold War peace was always more of a wishful fantasy on the part of the West than a reality. It was an ill-conceived concept that was incredibly one-sided, meaning we thought we had peace, the other guys not so much. While we in the West were reveling in this, defense budgets lagged, military readiness was stunted, and incredibly, some of our close allies took to mothballing their military equipment in museums. That's actually true. And I can go into that more later. From the Russians, they're doing what they've always done. When we took a breather after the Cold War, Russia never stopped. Their ideas of great power competition never waned, even as those of us in the West were embracing a different approach. Even today, we keep looking for deep introspective reasons why the Russians do what they do, but there is a rather simple explanation. The Russians embrace chaos and often provide those essential elements to make it happen. Chaos, Putin believes, is anathema to the West, especially to the United States. While we're talking about rules-based orders, transformational militaries, anti-corruption, the need for law and order, Russia does whatever it takes to fit itself in, often in a way where the US is essentially blocked from influence and power. It is enough for Putin not necessarily to come out on top, just as long as the West fails to succeed. China's approach, I would argue, is far more pragmatic, and I would also say it's instead of the destruction so characteristic of Russian attacks and invasions, China sees Hong Kong as Wall Street and Taiwan as chip maker for the world, but controlled by China. Its Belt and Road Initiative has been the basis for gobbling up real estate, particularly port facilities, natural resources, rare earth minerals, and attempts to control sea lanes, thereby disrupting global economies dependent on the movement of goods. Lest anyone think that there is not an us versus them, that one can separate the war in Europe from the Indo-Pacific or from the Middle East, that there is something here less than critical mass, I want to make a few following points. A few weeks ago, one of the largest hack attacks against Taiwan occurred. It was an attack from Russia, not China. In the past several months, there have been two major Chinese-Russian joint naval exercises in the Indo-Pacific. In the previous 10 years, there were none. For the first time ever, Russia and China conducted joint air operations in the Arctic and very close to the it's called the ADIZ, the Alaskan Air Defense Identification Zone. It's a designated area where countries have the authority to identify, locate, and control aircraft that are in their territory. And then China, with no contiguous geography, and we talked about this last night, at all, no contiguous geography, has decided simply by fiat that they're now an Arctic nation. And you better believe that everyone from Canada to Norway is really, really scared of this. So without China's machine tools and chips, Russian military production would slow considerably. Similarly, without Qatari money and Chinese support, Iranian weapons production would absolutely falter. Yet Russia has still found time to assist Iran, Hezbollah, and Assad's Syrian forces in the brutal murder of hundreds of thousands in Syria, many by chemical weapons that Russia helped aerosolize. What I mean by aerosolize is The Iranians didn't have the capability to spread that poison over a wide area. The Russians helped them do it and showed them how to do it and flew the planes that helped them do it. And so I just want to point that out. And there are estimates that between 680,000 and 800,000 Syrian civilians have been killed in this war, many of them by Iranian and Hezbollah troops. Russia's support for Iran, along with Russian training and equipping of Hezbollah and Hamas, was decades-long investment, but it requires others to pick up the slack since Russia, because of Ukraine, can't do this on a large scale. So as a result, China has managed a growing Mideast footprint. I say stomp because it's much larger than a footprint. And of course, you've now undoubtedly heard the news of North Korea's troops being trained and deployed in Russia. I'm hearing that they are arriving in the Kursk region of Russia. So Russia is now going to throw North Korean troops at the problems that it has in Kursk with Ukraine. So they just found other bodies that they can just throw like cannon fodder on this. I'm not sanguine that Iran will be signing up. I've been asked this question, so I thought I'd answer it before it gets asked. I don't think Iran's signing up to send personnel other than the trainers it has already sent to show the Russians how to use Iranian drones and long-range systems. But Iran has built weapons factories in Russia and near the border with Ukraine. But Iran's bogged down defending its own territory, a big chunk of the Levant, the Arabian Peninsula. And then the case one has not been watching. I don't know if people are aware of this. Over the last 6 months, they've been exchanging deadly attacks with the Taliban on their Afghan border. And to make its point, last week, Iranian border guards, along with the IRGC, do you guys know who the IRGC is? The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. They slaughtered over 200 Afghans attempting to cross the border, mostly women and children from Farsi-speaking tribes from Afghanistan. I did not see nary a mention of this in the mainstream media. Not at all. Which is really disappointing. And then I would be remiss if I didn't comment on Russia's growing role in Africa, which has contributed to endless civil wars, toppling of legitimately elected governments, and undermining every single UN, US, or EU mission designed to promote peaceful outcomes. So while Russia deploys Wagner forces, China supplies arms and equipment and proliferates these inherently unsafe, out-of-date nuclear reactors to energy-starved populations. There are safe. I'm pro-nuclear energy. There are safe nuclear reactors. It's not what China is selling to Africa. What is left largely unsaid publicly is what will be the quid pro quo for this largesse from North Korea, Iran, and China. As time goes on, it won't be just a handful of Sukhoi aircraft that Russia's already given to Iran. But what those countries really want is more sophisticated missile technology and physics packages to deliver weapons against them. And frankly, if you talk to people who are NATO Southern Tier, if you talk to Taiwan, if you talk to Korea, if you talk to Japan, talk to Australia, if you talk to New Zealand, their fear is that the trade-off for Russia for getting these weapons and these personnel is going to be that Russia will give their very sophisticated missile technology to North Korea and Iran. And that's just not going to be a problem for Israel. It's going to be a problem for NATO's southern flank and all of our Pacific allies. Russia's and the other piece too, I don't know if people are aware of this, Russia has the edge on China in terms of naval systems and naval missiles. And that's something China really, really wants. And that could be the quid pro quo for Chinese help as well, not just the cheap energy that they're now selling to China. So that will have significant consequences for freedom of navigation on the world's waterways. Now, I just wanted people to just sit back, take a moment, and think about the absolutely bizarre fact that North Korea is fighting a war in Europe, and that Iran is deploying significant assets to fight a war in Europe. Think about that. That's an incredible game changer. It is a freaking game changer, something we've not seen before. And it then puts everything in a perspective that we have to ask ourselves, what are we entering into? What is this age that we're entering into? How dangerous is this? What does this mean? And I say that, is there a way to seemingly stop this endless march into a very dangerous future? And I think there is. And I think it begins with the outcome of the war in Ukraine. because Ukraine is now ground zero for the confluence of East, West, and Middle East. And those who argued adamantly that the death knell for Ukraine as a sovereign nation sounded once Putin put his jackboot to Ukraine's throat, they've been proven wrong time and time again. The truth is Ukraine can and must win, and Russia must lose. But this means not making narrowly prescribed decisions based on threats of escalation. We had that conversation in one of the classes earlier today. Because it allows Putin to get away with outrageous behavior, and it allows him to hold the world hostage. And this has led to the inexplicable mountain Ukraine has had to climb just to get the equipment it needs to survive, let alone win. And I also want to make another point. People should understand this war is not only about Ukraine. It never was. Moscow's vision of grandeur includes those other countries that fled the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. If Russia can salvage any compromise from this war, it will terrorize not only its near abroad, but the rest of Europe. But the obverse is also true. Western resolve in helping Ukraine win will reverberate globally. Every country watching, especially China, Iran, and North Korea, they're planning now how they're going to respond to us. They plan their actions based on if they think we're not going to respond, what the danger is for them, what's their calculation. And the more we cow to Putin's threats, the more we cow to the Chinese, the more they're going to think they can just go forward and erase the liberal world order from the face of the planet and create what they want in its place. And so as Russia continues to bomb the most obvious of all civilian targets, as it continues to intentionally overfly NATO countries, testing NATO's vaunted air defense, which doesn't work very well, by the way, and hasn't, I think 4 different ships in the Romanian port of Constanța have been destroyed by Russian drones. There's been weapons that have hit Croatia, that have hit Romania, that have hit Poland multiple times, and Bulgaria. And now Russia's, before they could say it was an accident, I'm one of these people who believes that coincidence only goes far as the first time. Now Russia's intentionally overflying these countries to prove that it can do that, and they're not fighting back. And I'll get to some ways that I think we can fight back. So this gives Russia a safe haven at home by saying, no, we're not going to let them use our long-range weapons to hit these targets. No, we're not going to do this. So U.S. equivocation on weapons and their use have resulted in the Russians moving their military assets kilometers beyond the reach of those weapons. The continued emphasis about not permitting deep strikes appears more of a message to Russia than to Ukraine. In effect, we are conveying to Putin that he will continue to have the upper hand because the U.S. will not permit Ukraine to do that much damage to the Russian war machine. So stopping Putin in Ukraine is the smart and economical way to defend our interests. We got some questions in the last class on money here. Here's an answer. U.S. aid amounts to only 4% of our defense budget. And with that, and even more aid from Europe, Ukraine has destroyed up to 50% of Russia's conventional military capability. That is a return that we've never seen. That is real mathematics and demonstrating how Ukraine can assist U.S. national security policy. So, a couple final thoughts here. We are in the midst of an enormous strategic challenge that needs to be addressed now because we no longer have the kind of time we used to have for 5 or 10-year plans to find solutions. There are dramatic changes underway in the innovation, development, and production of critical weapon systems. And while our collective defense industries might not be perfect, they're getting there and faster than many here, and importantly, our enemies thought possible just a few years ago. Give you an example. At the beginning of World War II, the United States had 4 aircraft carriers. It was 2 or 4. By 1944, the United States had 115 ships. It was not the UK or France or other countries who defeated Germany. It was the United States, because of our industrial capacity, went to work and outproduced the German war machine in tanks, in planes, in aircraft, and in naval surface vessels. That's why the war was won. And I bring that up because our defense industries had problems. They've been lagging, and I mean every Western defense industry. It's something else I spend a lot of time on, and it's critically important because to win, you have to have innovation and production, and that's where we need to get back to going. So I'll say that the first two industrial revolutions occurred over 2 centuries, about 150 years. Now we're witnessing an industrial revolution every few months, but in the modern battle space, where wars are being fought in every conceivable domain, and I mean everything from cyber to psychological operations, we're witnessing a technological revolution every 2 to 3 days. Because of what we've experienced and witnessed, we now recognize that the modern battle space will be disruptive and all-encompassing. And that means we need to change our mindsets on how wars are being fought. The second point I would like to stress is that Russia's aggression in Ukraine has demonstrated how weapons-intensive major power war can be, and how this caught many of us in the West totally unprepared. Today, General Dynamics, who opened up 3 new factories in Mesquite, Texas, produces 400,000 155 military artillery pieces a year. Ukraine expends somewhere between 300 and 400,000 every 3 to 4 months. So I just want you to think about those numbers. The second point I'd like to stress is that Russia's aggression in Ukraine has, okay, so let's just wrap this up here. The reason for this is relevant is because if we help Ukraine defeat permanently Russia's grab for empire, then there won't be any more hand-wringing and doubt and the embarrassing quivering every time Putin is forward to unleash a new verbal threat. We need to remind ourselves that the United States is a superpower. It is the leader of nations strong enough not to enter into a Faustian bargain with Putin or Xi Jinping, who revel in every utterance suggesting they have the upper hand. Thank you.
Much appreciated, Deborah. That was great. So if I could, I'd like to ask a couple of questions. One is just around the idea of perceptions, and maybe this is just something that I've harbored, but I've always seen Russia, especially, and I think that the incursions into Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, has really borne this out. Is that Russia is not nearly as strong as many people think it is. And so they are vulnerable. And if you look at the military operations that Israel has conducted against Iran, Iran is not nearly as strong as people have perceived it to be. China, for all of its military buildup, has not fought an on-the-ground military conflict since 1979. And even then, the Vietnamese pushed them back. So I would never go so far, never be so naive as to say that these powers are paper tigers. But it seems to me that we have had a perception problem, and that our inability to kind of change our perception and act more assertively in a strategic manner has put us in the position that you describe. Would you like to amplify that or disagree with it? Or what would be your response to that notion?
I think we've spent too much time preempting ourselves. And what I mean by that is we've taken the placate rule. I admit it, and if you haven't figured it out from this little talk, I'm a hardliner. I admit it. On foreign policy, I've been a hardliner probably since birth. I come by this honestly from my mother and my father. But I think that when you preempt yourself, I said some of this in this class, when you preempt yourself by telling your enemy what you're not going to do, then that allows your enemy to prepare for everything else. So when you said to Vladimir Putin, don't worry, I'm not going to do this and I'm only going to let Ukraine do this, and Putin's going, woohoo, I've got this now and I know exactly what I need to do and I don't have to expend limited resources doing X because, Y is never going to happen. I think we've lost our concept of nuclear deterrence and what that means. There was a time through multiple administrations, Democrat or Republican, where when countries threatened us, someone get on the steps of the Pentagon and they would just say, they wouldn't say we're nuclear powered. They wouldn't do what Putin does. They're not as ham-fisted. They would just smile and say, we have a lot of assets at our disposal. End of discussion, which was the same way of conveying, we can wipe you off the face of the planet if we want to. So watch it. That's deterrence. That's what works. So I think the answer to your question is we have undercut our own deterrence strategy and even our sanctions, because the last few administrations have been sanctions happy, and sanctions, have a place. Some of them are more effective than others. Some of them are not effective at all. But even our sanctions have enough holes in them to drive a truck through. So there are US chips in that Russian equipment that's being produced every day because we still not managed to stop our own industry from sending stuff to Russia. There's a lot of heavy machinery that's still showing up that supposed sanctions were supposed to stop. And, oh, by the way, I was working with members of Congress they wanted to sanction Rosatom, which is the Russian atomic industry ministry. And I had to tell them, if you do that, you cut us off at the knees. And they go, what are you talking about? I said, we get 11% of our, first of all, we were getting 11% of our heavy fuel from Russia, who filled in after we sanctioned Venezuela. The Russians do not miss many opportunities. Secondly, we stopped producing in the 80s uranium for our nuclear reactors. We took it all from Russia. And now we get about 25% of those uranium fuel assemblies for our nuclear reactors, which, oh, by the way, are going to comprise 50% of our Green New Deal. We're still getting 50% of that. 25% of this stuff is coming from Russia because we didn't have our own industry. Now, having said that, we're getting there. We've now done HALEU. There's companies in the US that have started new uranium cascades and the like, but it could be 4 or 5 years from now before we're up to snuff on this. So where are we going to get this stuff from? It's either from that or this tiny amount from France, and France needs it for its own reactors. So we've kind of put ourselves into this box where we're overly dependent on China for things and we're overly dependent on Russia. So I throw that out there. And that scares people, and that's why they preempt themselves from doing things. Now, Russia's not going to cut this off right away because they want the hard currency money. This is important for them. But Russia can turn around and take those sweetheart deals and go to Malaysia and go to Indonesia and places like that who also want this, and they'll pay a higher price than what we've done in our long-term contracts with Russia. So I'm sorry to sort of go into the energy sphere, but I think this is all critically important for answering your question on this. But yeah, I think we're afraid of our own shadow. I'll just be perfectly honest, since it's such a small crowd. We're like Chicken Little on steroids sometimes, which is beyond my comprehension since we're like the big guy on the block.
And then maybe one other question, and then I'll send the mic over to Brian. No matter who wins the election next Tuesday, there's no doubt that Putin and Xi will test whoever the next president is. Where do you think are the key pressure points where those tests may come?
Well, after Biden took office, he made two decisions that I thought were devastating for this reinvasion of Ukraine. The first was he had planned on doing a freedom of navigation operation in the Black Sea, and he decided to please Putin that he would call the ships back, so they never went into the Black Sea. The history there is what happened with China, which is going back to the Bush administration through Obama. There were a dozen years where the U.S. didn't do a single freedom of navigation operation in the South China Sea. You don't think China noticed? Of course they did. And they started building airfields out of sandbars because they said, oh, the U.S. isn't going to come here. We're free to do whatever we want. So things like that happen. And then the other thing was removing the sanctions from Nord Stream 2, which to me was the ultimate invitation to Putin. Go ahead and invade, knock yourself out, have a good time, And so I think the testing will be along the lines of more joint air exercises in the Arctic. because it really does get people very, very upset here, especially China being a part of that, and more of this disappearing line between Europe and the Indo-Pacific. And in military terms, they called it, area of operations or theater of operations. And there have been people who've been advising Trump and people who've been advising Harris that the U.S. cannot walk and chew gum at the same time, meaning that you can't possibly handle operations in two theaters at once. And I'm going, hello, we're like the superpower, and that's just how they feel. I think that's where the testing will come. And I think there has to be a recognition with whomever's going to be president that separation that you thought you had in separate theaters, it doesn't exist anymore. It just doesn't exist. And they have to understand that, otherwise it's going to be exploited and we're going to come out on the losing end.
Thanks, Deborah. So my question is, I think what you've described in many ways is sort of what we experienced, I would say, after World War II, leading into 1949, where we had this question of how do we deal with the Soviet Union? And just as today, there were isolationists, there were those who thought we could cooperate with the Soviet Union, and Truman, after sort of famously had this question of how does he convince Americans to adopt versions of our policies from NSC 68. And the famous historical answer was Korea came along and saved us. And then the war provided a demonstration of the threat from the Soviet Union and the communist bloc. What do you think would be a way for whoever the next president is to convince the American public of the need to reassert our leadership on the world stage?
Yeah, I think that's, again, an excellent question here, because I think most people forget that in Korea, it started out as a UN operation, but they also forget that we were fighting directly China and the Soviet Union. In fact, some of the prisoners that China took during the Korea War, some of the Americans showed up in Russian camps. So there was, Soviet camps. So there was this, and I think you can also go to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you can go to, I think, 51 Yugoslavia, that sort of thing. As again, history is replete with this. We did nothing in 1956, and we did nothing in 1968, Hungarian and the Czech invasions of the Soviets. We sat on our hands. The Bush administration barely even did a whisper when Georgia was invaded. So I think historically, what I like to say is there's no threshold so low that Vladimir Putin can't trip over it. And what I mean by that is Russia will save us from ourselves. 10 years ago, people were saying NATO is irrelevant. It has no existence. It has no purpose. Get rid of it. And then Putin saved us from that. And I have every expectation that Xi Jinping and Putin will do this again. And I don't see, I think it's really hard. I had a mentor who one of my favorite people at the State Department who passed away about a year ago, who used to say to me, once you take something out, it's very hard to put it back. And what he was referring to is if you take forces out of Europe, it's going to be even harder to put it back. If you take nuclear weapons out of Europe, getting that negotiation to put them back is going to be virtually impossible. So when Obama came up with this idea of really drawing down forces from Europe, they did pull out a couple of brigades. And now we've had to put them back. By the way, the cost of putting them back is billions to the US taxpayer, whereas leaving them there at lower levels and keeping the facilities open and stuff would have been millions, And plus, because of the agreements we had with those countries, they paid the rent and a lot of the infrastructure for us. It was not coming out of your taxpayer's pocket. So I think what will happen is the bad guys are going to save us from ourselves again, because they will do something incredibly and monumentally stupid that will cause us to unify, just like Sweden and Finland saying, "Okay, we're done. We're not going to do this anymore." And by the way, it was Sweden who literally put, and I'm using literally correctly here, weapons in museums. And when the Russians decided to start playing chicken in Swedish waters and flying over Swedish territory, they had to take the weapons out of museums. It was so bad that Germany had an exercise 2 years ago where they had to use broomsticks because they didn't have enough rifles for their soldiers. When Germany's turn, NATO had this rapid reaction force, and it was, on paper, it looked really good. And then they started having to deploy. And Germany couldn't find 3 guys and a dog to go to Latvia when their turn came to go there. Now that's changed, and they actually sent their force, and Canada sending a force there. But what people had done is, okay, we're cool. We're just going to bake this on paper. And then there was no reality to the forces that were listed on paper. So the forcing action is usually the bad guys really misbehaving and people realizing, oh, we're here and we've got to do something about it. We're going to be overrun.
Thank you. So one question that you often see in discussions of the sort of alliance of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea today as comparison to, say, the Soviet alliance in the Cold War was the difference in the economic integration of countries like Russia, China in particular, not so much Iran and North Korea. And so many people call for the sort of one solution being a return to some kind of Western, or not Western, democratic club or club of good actors to limit the economic integration or capabilities of countries like China or Russia. Now, as you've talked about, for the US, this poses today considerable cost because you become so dependent on goods for a variety of things, including energy from countries like Russia and for other goods from China in particular. Do you think that for this idea of trying to sort of reinvigorate our energy industrial base or amongst our allies as an alternative supply chain so that we can create this sort of trade club to sort of cripple the economies of countries like Russia and China would be a way to grow, similar to sort of how many see the Soviets were essentially starved out of Western capital or capital markets, which was a way to collapse their economy?
I do think there's a way, but I think we work across purposes here. So we have, we talked a little bit this morning about climate change and the like, and you have this, the not in my backyard idea. So up until 1985 or 88, the US was the single largest producer and exporter of rare earth minerals. Up until the late 80s, the US was a larger exporter of nuclear reactors and nuclear fuel assemblies. And then we just decided, we can do this elsewhere. Up until the 90s, the US was the largest producer of energetics. Energetics are the fill, or as I call it, the stuffing that makes, artillery go boom, And then now you have to get it from India or China, a little bit in Poland, a little bit here and there, because the Navy decided we weren't going to use weapons like this anymore. Well, guess what? We're using them every day again. So yeah, there are ways to do this, but part of it means, and I think this is a really good issue for students particularly, is when you look at climate change, when you look at this stuff, there is this hubris and arrogance on the part of people in the US who live fairly comfortable lives about, well, you're not going to dig for that tritium or that titanium in the US because you'll ruin our thing, but it's okay to make poor people in Africa dig for it in mines there. It's this, it is a level of arrogance that is just mind-boggling to me, to call yourself a liberal progressive thinker and then just say it's okay for those people to do this for us because we don't want to dirty our hands or ruin our scenery. But the fact of the matter is the US has hundreds of thousands, if not millions of tons of rare earth minerals. In Nevada, in California, there was just another find in, was it New Mexico? Arkansas, huge find. So that sort of thing. Yes, so there's alternatives. Australia also has, in Australia for years was like letting the Chinese in and invest in this, and they've sort of gone back to not doing that now. So on rare earth minerals, there is a very strong possibility if we allow responsible mining to go forward that we could be supplying ourselves. I'll tell you one humorous story, if I might. I was meeting with the now former Australian Minister of Mining. It's a huge industry there. So they have a minister accountant and he was in the US and we were having a meeting and he had just come from Australia in Canberra, where they had a big conference of miners who came from all over the world to this conference. And there were these protesters who were against mining. And they had their cell phones moving, and this is a critical point, and they were taking pictures of this. And one of the people taking the pictures and yelling spit on the minister. And the minister turned around and he looked at him and he said, "You know that cell phone you just recorded me with when you spit on me? Where do you think this stuff came from? It came from the mine that you're spitting on right now." And there was this incredible stunning lack of understanding that the things that they were protesting were allowing them to do what they wanted to do. They didn't understand what goes into that battery. You know, I have a pacemaker in my chest. I have titanium in my chest. It has to come from a mine, you know? So these are things that you just, understand. And yes, the US has this. It has the capacity. It has the capability. We have the capability to convert to smart grid technology, which would put 5,000 people on a grid instead of 5 million, which would then allow us to not worry about, attacks on the grid and that sort of thing. But we haven't done it. So it's out there. And so what I encourage students, when you look at proposals that you say, oh, I'm for this and I'm against that, understand there's always second, third, and fourth order consequences to what you're doing and what you're looking at. And those consequences may be anathema to what your core beliefs are. So yes, I think infrastructure-wise, we can do this. We know how to do this. The question is whether we can do this quickly enough and fast enough to cause the type of harm you're talking about to these other countries and lessen our dependencies.
Sure. And thanks to everyone from the audience who submitted questions, and feel free if you want to write down questions on a note card. Daniel will pick them up. So kind of picking up on what you had talked about before, Deborah, one member of the audience says, the Ukraine invasion has tested NATO. What is the future of NATO with the present challenges of Russia? And then related to that, what are your thoughts about mobilization in Scandinavia?
Okay, so on the NATO piece, there's some good news. NATO has recently introduced something called the DIU. It's their Defense Innovation Unit, and it's a new function, and it's very sort of modeled on a very similar one that the Pentagon recently introduced, which allows you to bypass a lot of the standard contracting and processes that impede your ability to get through things and to move them more quickly. So NATO's idea with this Defense Innovation Unit is to sort of be able to explore everything from ideas, innovation to development to production to procurement of things at light speed. Now, NATO and light speed is sort of an oxymoron. So I don't know how it's going to prove out, but Ukraine then gives you a lesson learned for this. So when the Shahid drones came from Iran and were hitting Ukraine, we had no early warning system because US, Western radars, all of our radars are built on, you've heard the expression beneath the radar screen. Well, these fly at a level that are beneath the radar screen. So they're not necessarily picked up in terms of an early piece. So what are you going to do about this? Ukraine's early warning was they had the word in Ukrainian locomotion. It sounded like a locomotion, 10 cars speeding down the rail tracks coming at you at 200, kilometers an hour. And that was their early warning. So Ukraine came up with something called Sky Fortress, where they had two physicists working on something out of their backyard, garage, whatever, where you slap something up a cell phone telephone pole and it can do target acquisition. It saw it's coming. It's changed the whole dynamic in how you do early warning. The West had nothing like this, nothing. And I raise that because, necessity is the mother of invention, obviously, but also when you're fighting for your existential existence, you tend to develop things a lot more quickly than someone who's sort of sitting safely in their home and has two oceans on either side of them and that sort of thing. So I think that this Defense Innovation Unit is going to work because I think people are now taking those lessons from Ukraine and they're not putting them on a shelf. They're implementing them daily. So in the battle space now, there's a 24, 36-hour turnaround. This weapon got jammed. How are we going to fix this? Israel's the same way. Okay, let's do this. Okay, within 24 to 36 hours, they have a fix. We would be sitting here for 6 months arguing about the fix. Should there be a fix? How are we going to do the fix? Blah, 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 blah. The U.S. industry and some of the Western European industry and the like, and South Korea, who is just amazing stuff with their defense industry and how quickly they can turn on a dime. We're kind of like an aircraft carrier, and South Korea is like that cigarette boat delivering drugs, that quick. And we're kind of like, okay, we're eventually going to get there. And so, yes, I do think that we're getting there. And I've seen the U.S. look at this stuff, come back and say, okay, fix this. A recent one, I won't say who the company was, took 5 months. Now some of these things are taking a month, which is pretty darn fast for us in terms of software fixes. But it also means rebuilding your industry along the lines of building some lines that can have fixes to them so you don't have to strip everything down and start from all over, which is really hard. So now with modern technology, with AI, with other things, you can make those changes, build those changes in so that it's a software tweak and not revamping an entire weapon system like that. On the NATO piece, in terms of mobilization.
Right, in Scandinavia.
Yeah, so what is this, who asked the question? What's the specific question about mobilization? Yeah, please.
Well, just about with the Russian threat, and Finland is starting to mobilize and train, and
Right.
How does that impact Scandinavia?
Okay, so for Finland, interestingly enough, unlike Sweden, Finland never drew down because they had the 1,200-kilometer border with Russia. So Finland always had mandatory military service. They always had, sometimes it was 10 months, sometimes it was a year. It's mandatory national service. And it's always been part of their thing, I think, because, as I like to say, the neighborhood they live in. And they had a ready reserve of 400,000 that they can mobilize within 48 hours. And they're everything from doctors to lawyers to engineers to architects to everything. And they practice a lot. So Finland really didn't have that far to go in terms of its mobilization. I think you're going to find more conscription among some countries. Who are not meeting or weren't trying or didn't have recruitment goals to meet. So I think their fast, quick patch is conscription. I don't think that's the answer for the United States at all. I don't think we're ever going to go backwards to that. I didn't protest the Vietnam War because of Vietnam War. I protested it because of conscription, because I felt it was uneven. More people who were disadvantaged were going off to war while wealthy people were not. And I thought that was inherently un-American. That was my view. It wasn't like World War II or Korea where you had a more even-based conscription. So I think some of the European countries are turning back toward conscription. For Sweden, it was a whole rethink. And that's why the center-right parties got voted back in office, because there was a recognition that everything you had bargained for no longer existed. So they've always had a good military. I was with them in Afghanistan, and they were up north, and they did really well. I think it was a matter of numbers and getting it together, but I think they're going back to their roots. Again, 5th largest air force in the world, 15 years ago. I think they're going back to the roots.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you for that. So to get back to the students, and actually this is a question that I think applies to everyone. What are the good sources for keeping up with international events, for example, Iran versus Afghanistan, which aren't mentioned in the mainstream news? I mean, we know that, I remember because I used to live in the Washington, D.C. area. Even the Washington Post would just have like a page of international news every day, and that was it. Maybe they've changed since then, but it is really difficult, even in the age of the internet, to get a lot of information about what's going on in other parts of the world. How do you stay current, and what advice would you give to the audience in order to better educate themselves about what's going on, especially in terms of strategic moves?
So I think this is where AI and, modern technology really comes into play. So I have on my computer, I've installed a lot of, I'm like one of the people, as I laugh, I say at my age, a lot of my friends' issue technology. I love it. I think it's great. You're going to make me live longer. You're going to make my life easier. I'm all for it. So I have set up on my devices feeds that recognize certain words. And those feeds can come from all over the place. So even like I use like an old Yahoo thing, and I could direct my feeds to what I want to see come over that. So it can grab stuff, anything from Forbes to Wall Street Journal to Business Insider to the Kiev Post to some guy blogging in Russia to there's a bunch of guys who are blogging out of Lebanon, out of Israel, and so I'm set up to get those feeds. And so I read a lot, which is probably why I'm blind as a bat, so I read a lot and I get those feeds, and I tend not to read the feeds necessarily from any of the mainstream guys, because they're really repeating what someone else has said, or they're giving their jaundiced view of the world or whatever. And I was saying to the director of the School of Journalism now that I don't even have to look at I don't even have to look at who is the subject of something, because I know if it says this about the Middle East, it's going to be AP. I know if it says this about the White House, it's going to be Reuters. I know if it has this particular view on something else in the Middle East, it's going to be BBC. I know it without even looking at who it is, because their biases are so in your face that you know who they are. So, I look at them, go through them just to get a picture of it. But I would set up your feeds to look at stuff that's more global. Like for news out of Africa, France 24. Are you aware of France 24? Anyone who does Africa is excellent, because you might not agree with everything they say, but they still have coverage of Africa because they had such a presence there. Now, I don't know, since they were kicked out of Mali, whether that's going to continue, but but I always found that they're very good to look at for things like that. And so I would not, I have to say that I really don't listen to ABC, CBS, NBC, MSNBC, or whatever, but I will read their online stuff from them, from Fox, whatever, just to see what people are thinking, So I do that to so I know in my mind, if I go to Capitol Hill and I say, I think I need more money for this weapon system, this sort of thing, I have a background of who's reading what and what they're thinking. But I'd open that aperture, and for goodness sake, I use AI to sort of query that, and then figure out, not saying just depend on them, but as an ancillary tool to query that, and then, lard up your reading input with that sort of thing. And because I talk to people all the time who get one view, one perspective. And I like to say Americans have forgotten how to argue, because we're too busy killing each other to argue. We've forgotten how to debate. We've forgotten how to argue. And I have many friends like that, and they'll call me, and I had someone who was staying at my house recently, was arguing about something that happened in Colorado Springs like 15 years ago. And she was adamant that she was right. And I said, yeah, but it was 15 years ago. She says, yeah, but I was still right. And I'm like, okay, I don't have time for this. This was sort of ridiculous, because that's the only thing she read. So that's what I would say.
Thank you for that. So one question or another question deals with, again, the election, and what foreign policy would look like under a Harris administration, and I'll add to that, under a Trump administration. Would there be much difference? And if so, what would those differences be? And also, who will be making the decisions? Who will be advising either a President Harris or a President Trump in foreign policy come January?
I'm going, okay, I am not Nostradamus, thank goodness for that. I don't have a crystal ball. I will say, and I've said this before, so if I bore any of you, forgive me, but I do think that, I always say this, that if you put Elizabeth Warren and Rand Paul in the same room, they'd be in violent agreement on foreign policy because they're both, really strong isolationists and also have a lot of the same sort of hatreds and feelings. And people don't like it when I say that, but it's pretty accurate if you listen to what they say. I think the far right sticks its neck out on things like affection for Vladimir Putin. They have an affection for Russia, for Orban, people like that. The far left has an affection for Xi Jinping that I don't understand. So I think it's like pick an authoritarian, and we're going to go with this guy, and we'll go with the other guy. So I don't think there's a lot of daylight there. I don't know. I don't know exactly who Harris will pick. I think the betting is on Phil Gordon, her current national security advisor, because I don't think he can get confirmed. If the Senate turns Republican or whatever, I still don't think he'll get the vote. I think it'll be a tough confirmation fight that she might not want to take on early on in the administration if she gets elected. And he has got a pretty uneven track record on Russia and an even worse one on Iran. So I don't know how he'd react to that. I mean, there was a lot of hand-wringing about, Trump's affection for Russia and that sort of thing. But the Obama administration, despite saying we don't like Putin, had a lot of Faustian bargains with Putin in order to get their Iran agreement. And Phil Gordon was part of the Russian reset and everything else and didn't want to give up on that. So there is that. I don't know who Trump would pick. If he picked someone like Pompeo or O'Brien or people like that, I think he'll have a much more common sense and better national security policy. If he picks Rick Grenell, all bets are off. So I don't know. There's certainly neither of them are coming to me to ask my view. Yeah, I can tell you that because I'm known as the equal opportunity hater. So,
And then maybe one follow-up to that is, so how do we get the American public to be interested in foreign policy? Because let's face it, most folks, in the US, when an election's coming up, they're just focused on domestic issues. They might say, well, the world's in chaos, but, and we get that, but gas prices are too high. Price of eggs is too high. And I'm just not making it economically. So I really don't have the time or inclination to care about Iran or Afghanistan or Russia. How do we solve that problem? And maybe one other thing I'll mention, because I'm thinking about the presidential debates. It used to be that they would divide up the debates. There would be one debate on domestic issues, and then there would be the second debate on foreign policy. That's totally gone by the wayside now. So how do we impress upon the public that this matters? Because it seems like the interest has been dissipating precipitously over the last, say, 15 to 20 years.
I think one of the worst jobs we've done is by suggesting that economic concerns, the price of gas and everything are totally dependent on domestic issues, and they're not. And I think that's where we've made the big mistake. So we made decisions domestically because of climate change and other things. This whole issue on fracking back and forth on this. So let me give you an example. So Massachusetts, New York, I think New Hampshire, maybe not New Hampshire, but no, Connecticut. They did not want any pipelines at all going through their things. So one of the biggest gas plays in the world is the Utica gas play, big chunk of it in Pennsylvania. And because of Pennsylvania's environmental laws, it was, I would say, some of the most responsible fracking on the face of the planet that went on there, and reforestation and everything. It was all done with, Democrat governors and everything else, and it worked out. So the price of heating your homes and the like for people who live in the Mid-Atlantic is about 50% less than what people pay for in upstate New York and in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, and those places, because they didn't want that. A couple of years ago, there was a Russian gasification ship docked at the port of Boston, the Boston Harbor, providing gas, natural gas, to Massachusetts because Massachusetts didn't want to buy US gas. I mean, talk about craziness. And because there's this US law from the 1920s that said you can't bring a ship from like the Gulf of Mexico up to supply gas to Massachusetts unless that ship was made in a US shipyard. The US hasn't made an LNG ship since 1985. I think we produced our first one last year, maybe. So this is the craziness. That affects the price people are paying. I mean, and that's a foreign issue. It's what you decide to do domestically. Here's another one. We cut off, we had sanctions against Venezuela. The type of oil produced in the United States is not the type of crude that you need to mix to go in at your local gas pump. It's not what we produce. We only had 3 facilities in the entire United States to make that conversion. They're really expensive to build. No one else was building them. So we were importing this 10, 11% of this heavy crude. I call it dirty crude, but heavy crude from Venezuela. So that Venezuela gets sanctions, guess who moved into the market to fill that 11%? Russia. So we were buying 11% of our heavy crude from Russia to mix with what we did in order to fill the gas pump. That starts to go away. Biden administration goes back, starts talking to Venezuela. Venezuela, goes like this, because China and Russia told them to. So that makes your imports have to go back up. Biden administration decided to go after the Saudis and the Emiratis because of human rights issues. And then when Biden then goes back to them and says, we need your help on this to keep prices down domestically, he got another one of these because he blew them off for about 2 years and then all of a sudden he needed them. It's what I call a lack of a strategic vision of understanding the consequences of your actions. It might feel good, but the pain that comes afterwards. So I think the way you convince people of this is what you do in the global commons is going to affect the price that people pay for groceries because it's shipment, right? It's transportation. It's everything that goes into that infrastructure. And if we've learned anything from COVID, it's how could you have a supply chain so bloody reliant on China? How could you do that? And then companies were going back again for another drink at the trough, which made no sense to me. So that's what affects this. And if you start to do more sanctions against China, Americans are used to buying cheap prices from China. So producing that domestically is going to cost more money because we actually pay our workers better. So yes, that's how you convince them that these are not mutually exclusive.
Very good. We have some more
Questions from the audience, but I wanted to give Brian a chance to interject and. You're good? Okay. So another question relates to U.S. intelligence agencies and how they get information regarding what's going on in Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. So, and we don't want you to divulge any state secrets or to compromise any kind of security clearance that you have. But what's your?
I don't have one now, but you have to sign away your life to get the previous.
You do? Okay. Can you tell us or share kind of your opinion on how U.S. intelligence agencies are getting information about what's going on in Russia, China, North Korea? Is it effective? And how can they help the U.S. be successful in being more strategic or at least not, preempting ourselves, to use your phrase?
Well, I mean, my sad thing on this is I don't think the U.S. intelligence community has gotten anything right in Russia in about 25 or 30 years. And I think, frankly, a lot of what we get about Iran is coming from Israel and other parties because we just don't have the assets anymore. So we made a lot of decisions that have come out to be really bad decisions. So our ability to collect in terms of meaning human intelligence and that sort of thing, I think is not very good in a big chunk of the world now. We have better means through high tech and that sort of thing, but the concept of the spies and paying people for information, that sort of thing. A lot of that has not been good for a long time. There was always a question too, when I was like in Moscow, I remember CIA people paying people for information that I would get for free as a diplomat. And I'm going, why are you paying them? They're just going to tell you what you want to hear. So there's always that downside. And we were just like, what are you nuts? You're just larding the pantry here. So, but I don't think the U.S. intelligence community is where it should be at. And I think it's done a lot of things wrong, going back to not predicting in the 90s, not predicting that India and Pakistan were going to test nuclear weapons and become nuclear powers. They missed that too, by the way. NSA's excuse was it was over a weekend and we didn't see it. So this has been going on for a long time. I think they need a refit and a retrofit. I think Defense Intelligence Agency generally does a better job because they're more sober and less political than the other agencies. They're not really run by a political appointee. They're run by generals come up through the ranks. So, but yeah, I don't think we do a very good job right now. Our high tech is unparalleled on that, but our human collection is just more wrong than right.
And so to get back to Ukraine for a second. So if we don't want to see Putin win, then what's preventing us from having Ukraine join NATO?
Ooh, I've spent the last 3 weeks in meetings on this. I'll quote a Czech colleague. Brian, historian here, after the Second World War, when we were allowing the Soviets to sort of gobble up a bunch of territory, there were promises made by Churchill, by Truman, to countries like Czechoslovakia and the others that, we got your back, don't worry. And so when the Biden administration came up with this thing for the NATO summit, the Washington summit, that a bridge to NATO membership. And I was in the room where there was a White House person briefing, and we had a thing at the Atlantic Council, and we had senior officials from all the relevant embassies. And the Czech representative, who was a good friend, who was the former deputy defense minister, raises his hand. He goes, "The last time you promised us a bridge, you threw us under it." So I thought, what a great comment. And then the Slovak joined in and said, yeah, where he is. And so I thought that was a great comment, because that was my view of this bridge. There was some movement among, I would say, between 14 and 15 NATO countries to move much further on membership. This was scuttled by the US because it was paying attention to Germany and not to the other countries. And some of the countries, when I say 14 or 15, we're not just talking the Balts, and we're not just talking the East Europeans here. We're talking other countries who are sort of west of that divide as well. The only way Ukraine's security is going to be guaranteed is with an Article 5 guarantee. I frankly don't think the US Senate, either Republicans or Democrats, are in the mood to do that. It's not Sweden or Finland. It's an implication. Everyone knew when NATO enlarged the second time that Ukraine was going to become the cordon sanitaire between Russia and Europe. It made the Germans happy because they were no longer on the front lines when it expanded. And then they went back into their, oh, we're good now. So I think it is disappointing, despite what was said at the Washington summit, that this administration is still playing footsie on what to do about NATO. And I think it's a mistake. As I said, Portugal entered NATO when it was still a dictatorship. Germany was in NATO when it was a divided country. So there's ample precedent. And Spain was a democracy for 2 years and a half second before they got into NATO. Because wasn't, Franklin was there for, yes, whatever. So there is precedent for that. As long as we say it'll never happen as long as the war goes on, that gives Russia a vote, because all Russia has to do is lob a missile or two and say the war's still going on, so they can't join. So the way we've done this gives Russia a veto over this, which I think is just absolutely wrong. I'm not quite in the minority about this in Washington. There's a lot of people who are gradually coming around to the way some of us has thought about this initially. But I don't think that there is even a plurality on the Hill on both sides of the aisle on this one. I can name the Republicans and the Democrats who would support it. But I don't think it's nearly enough that would ever get confirmation.
Right, and that sort of leads to the next question, which is, so is there a future where uniting against Russian and Chinese threats in a bipartisan way is possible? Because so far we haven't been able to do it, even though the threats are clear and present. Would it take a more dramatic set of circumstances, an expansion of current conflict to bring the parties together so that they could get our priorities straight, do the right thing? Or is that just impossible given the polarized environment in Washington?
No, I think it is possible, and I think it's inevitable. I think they're going to have to come to this decision because, like I say, there's all this talk about Trump's affection for Putin, but Trump really hates the Iranians, and then so you have that, and then now you have that confluence going on. You have people on the left who are like, we really like Xi Jinping, but we're not so crazy about Kim Jong-un, So there is this, the point that I try to get across, and the point that I think we all should try to get across is, no, it's a false dichotomy to say that this is not the new axis. And it's the true axis of evil, that there's no separation. Every day, in so many ways, when you have North Koreans on European territory, when you have what Iran's doing, your argument against this is just gone. It's just gone. So I think, yes, there is a way to do that. And I think there are people who recognize that. And I think eventually, and I hope it won't take that long, like I said, the enemy gets a vote. And they voted to come after you. And they're not going to do it China over here, Russia over here, North Korea over here, and Iran. They're going to do it together. And I think there's enough suspicion and anger on the parts of the various people who support some dictators but not others that it'll eventually bring them together. And I also said, no threshold so low that Vladimir Putin won't trip over it. I think these guys are going to trip over it. They're going to do something that becomes a bridge too far. And that will bring that coalition together.
Thank you for that. And then another question, which I think is terrific, just spot on, is whether or not there is a meaningful difference between Russia losing and Ukraine winning.
Interesting question. It depends on how you define winning and how you define losing. I think Russia has to lose. And what I mean by losing for them is, not that, Russia has to collapse, but they have to be defeated in such a way that their aggressive measures that they like to take don't happen again, at least not for another 10 years or whatever. Because I don't think they'll ever break themselves of the habit. But what it means when I say Ukraine winning, that means that it succeeds to become what it wants to be is an independent sovereign nation, not under the yoke of anyone else's empire. And what I mean by that is an economically viable nation as well, because winning without having Crimea is telling Ukraine that they're going to be Bangladesh. Meaning if you don't have access to your port facility and you can't do shipping on the Black Sea, because Odessa is pretty small, and if you lose that facility, then you're not making it economically viable. And the world has tons of countries that never should have broken off from other countries and become countries because they cannot sustain themselves. They can't feed themselves. They can't clothe themselves. They can't do anything without international assistance. And I'm not trying to make fun of Bangladesh, but Bangladesh, other than a small textile industry and actually workers who sew for those tall textile industries, has nothing. and they will always be an assistance-based economy. And my argument on Ukraine is, if you talk about what you're talking about without a victory, without an economically viable country, then you've lost. So I think that's something to keep in your mind, that you don't want to create something that's you want to create something that is not always a recipient of assistance, but also that. Think of what Ukraine's done. Their intellectual property capabilities alone could make that country a fortune. And that's what you want. That's winning.
Right. And then rebuilding Ukraine would be, I think, an economic boon to Eastern Europe, Western Europe, NATO countries. And so that would be, to me, at least one of the incentives to defeat Russia, so that we can create, presumably, a model industrial democracy in the heart of Eastern/Central Europe. I know that, because we're doing a lot of work in Kosovo, for example, and the Russians are obviously helping the Serbs, and that's one of the reasons why the Kosovars they're such staunch supporters of Ukraine. And I think that and we also have a lot of partnerships in Romania too. And what I hear from Kosovars and Romanians is that winning in Ukraine is absolutely essential, because rebuilding Ukraine will help rebuild a lot of countries, or many countries in Eastern Europe, and will promote democracy, more importantly. Do you share that opinion?
I think, first of all, you can't talk about the Western Balkans without talking about the absolute underhanded role of the Russian Orthodox Church. So the Russian Orthodox Church has turned into, a frontline spy mission in a lot of these countries. So in Montenegro, in Kosovo, in it's like you dropped the mic again. Anyway,
Serbia.
yeah, in Serbia, obviously. So the Russian Orthodox Church now has been set up that they report on dissidents who live there. And this is one of the reasons why a couple of the countries, including Ukraine, has broken with the Russian Orthodox Church, and they're now doing their own separate church because of this. So it is, when I say all domains, when I'm referring to a war, I'm also referring to that. I'm referring to operations that are going on inside of Europe, all over the place, by Russia, by China, by others, that undermine the safety and security of people, undermine their views of religion, undermine their views of a whole host of things. So when I say all domain, it's not just air, land, sea, base, cyber. It is this whole influence operation, its whole intelligence operation, and is done through a whole bunch of things. But the church in the Western Balkans has been critically important to pursuing Russians' aims, and people should make no mistake about that. There is economic rejuvenation for Ukraine does not have to cost the world a fortune. What the G7 agreed to, and the US was reluctant, Canada was actually the first country agreed to do this, was to take the interest from held Russian assets under sanctions and use that interest as part of funding for Ukraine. The next step is, of course, to take the assets themselves, not just the interest rates. And Italy and France have strange objections to this. Also, Italy and France agreeing on something is kind of interesting. But they're worried about what it does to the world economic order and that sort of thing. I think it's there are much smarter people than I, but there are former secretaries of the Treasury under multiple administrations who I've spoken with, who've been very vocal on this publicly. Phil Zelikow, met with him like 2 weeks ago, very smart on this stuff. And this can be, he was actually one of the people who convinced the Biden administration and Treasury to do this, to do these forward. It's not going to undermine this. So I think that, yes, I think this rebuilding can go on, but it's a safety and security issue for them as well. It's sort of, you're going to, if you defeat the bad guy, it's sort of, you're going to have to now rethink how they can get away with what they've been getting away with. you know. And I'm surprised no one's asked about Erdogan or Orban, but there you go. So,
Well, very good. Well, maybe we can talk about Erdogan and Orban tomorrow when we visit with political science students. And so in the interim, let's give Deborah a big round of applause for her wisdom and her insight and just her wonderful sort of perceptions into what matters in the world. So thank you.